Good morning. It's a quiet crowd today. So I'm Anne Leonard. I'm Manton Curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs here at the Clark. I'm the exhibition curator for Shadow Visionaries. I'm very, very pleased to welcome you to this lecture, and by extension to everything going on at the Clark this weekend. And I hope you'll take some time to peruse the exhibition also, if you haven't had time to do that already. So yeah, just look forward to spending this next hour together with you. Normally I begin these lectures with a bit of art history or a sort of exhibition thesis. Today, I'm going to start with a mood. So in the exhibition, Shadow Visionaries, you'll find dark doorways, mysterious shadowy portals, light coming in through tangles of branches, pensive creatures, both human and non-human, wanderers trying to make their way, perhaps lost, and supernatural flying creatures of various sorts. Now, you will have noticed that all these exhibition images I've showed are black and white, all works on paper, and all are eerie or semi-spooky in character. It may surprise you to learn that most were made in the same period when realism was considered ascendant. The Grand Universal Exposition that France hosted in 1855 was intended to showcase the country's forward march of industrial progress. Along with the displays of machinery and technological marvels was an exhibition of art and a completely separate pavilion dedicated to the realism of Gustave Courbet. All in all, 1855 was seen as the death knell of Romanticism. But one begins to notice that the dominance of realism at this period is a phenomenon limited to painting. Works on paper tell a very different story. In fact, if you know where to look, it's relatively easy to show that a romantic undercurrent persists throughout the mid-century period. Now, for an extreme contrast, let me show you Courbet's Burial at Ornans, one of the paintings he displayed in his realist pavilion, next to, on the screen, Rodolphe Brédin's print, The Comedy of Death. Only one of these works is in the exhibition, and I'll let you guess which one. You could say they both deal with death, but there the similarities end. There's a staggering difference in scale. I've given you the dimensions, but I have also done the math and realized that the painting is 637 times the size of the print. Of course, we're talking about color versus black and white, and Courbet's portrait verisimilitude, the people assembled for this burial in his hometown are actually identifiable, as opposed to Brédin's allegory. And now, using the same pair, let's consider an excerpt from Courbet's Realist Manifesto of 1861 against a statement by the poet Gérard de Nerval, who I'm using as a sort of proxy for Brédin because they were closely allied. So according to Courbet, painting is an essentially concrete art and can only consist of the representation of real and existing things, full stop. And then Nerval saying, I believe that the human imagination has never invented anything that is not true, whether in this world or in other worlds. So what we have here, quite simply, are two diametrically opposed views of art, one based strictly on what the eye can see, the other taking off from what the imagination can conjure up. Now, there seems to be something about black and white media that favors fantasy and the imagination. Color is highly descriptive of things in the world, perhaps even too descriptive. Without it, an artist has freer reins for dreams, the supernatural, and surreal. Here are two works in the exhibition showing the power of shadows and light. In Delacroix's lithograph of the Three Witches from Shakespeare's Macbeth, Scraped highlights create wild energy and a spine-tingling atmosphere. In Bonvin's etching, Printmaker at Work, which might well be a self-portrait, a brilliantly illuminated screen diffuses lamplight, almost halo-like, around the head of the artist to suggest quasi-divine inspiration. This exhibition proposes a counter-narrative for French art of the middle decades of the 19th century. That's a period of French history synonymous with modernity, industrialization, and material progress. Many of the artists on my checklist not only didn't go along with these prevailing trends, but were actively opposed to them, hence my subtitle, Against the Current. These images, for example, give an ambivalent picture of progress, reminding us that for every soaring vault and shining edifice, there was an underside. The social costs included backbreaking ill-paid labor and sometimes the destruction of entire neighborhoods, leading to the displacement of their longtime residents. It's probably time now to explain the term Shadow Visionaries. To be very, very clear, this is not a name from the period, but it's new for this exhibition. Shadow, I'm talking about artists who dealt with dark subject matter, the macabre, the supernatural, and they toiled largely in the shadows, i.e. out of the limelight. For the most part, their works received little to no public attention in exhibitions or the marketplace. And finally, why visionary? Well, their inspiration came from dreams and imagination, not the visible world. But it's important to emphasize that the artists featured did not constitute a formal group. Even Charles Mérion and Rodolphe Brédin, two printmakers born just a year apart, who shared a highly detailed, obsessive graphic style, never met, and by all accounts, weren't aware of each other's work. I've assembled the artists in the exhibition because of their shared preoccupations with dreams and anti-realist subject matter. Photography is included, despite its reputation for cool objectivity. I believe that its documentary function has been vastly overplayed, especially in the early decades of the medium, eclipsing the emotional engagement of photographers with their subjects. And photography is deeply entwined with loss and nostalgia, feelings that often intensify in times of rapid progress when things seem to be slipping away. And when it comes to printmaking, the major touchstone for the Shadow Visionaries was the Spanish artist Francisco Goya and his impact on Eugène Delacroix, the leading French romantic. In 1799, Goya published a set of 80 prints called Los Caprichos. They were revolutionary, not only in their subject matter, but also in their use of aquatint, a tonal print technique that Goya pushed to its expressive limits. Delacroix, thanks to his friendship with the French ambassador to Spain, had access to the very first set of caprichos known to enter France. Profoundly moved by these haunting works, Delacroix set about experimenting with aquatint himself. And if you see in the margins, you can see the test strips where he's trying different tonal gradations of this medium. Trying to reproduce Goya's method was a tall order by any standards. The more important takeaway for Delacroix, arguably, was seeing how this variability of tone, seeing how this variability of tone from mottled grays to deep blacks lent itself to supernatural and monstrous subject matter. Delacroix tried out these same effects with another new print process, lithography, which etymologically means drawing on stone. From the flying Mephistopheles in Goethe's Faust, here on the right, to Hamlet's encounter with his father's ghost in the tragedy by Shakespeare, Delacroix adopted Goya's repertoire of ghosts and ghouls and translated it into his own idiom, daring viewers to confront the boundaries between life and death, between belief and doubt. Now, while Goya's influence on French making is widely acknowledged, it's most often considered a romantic phenomenon that wanes by the 1850s. In the exhibition, though, we can see that influence persisting through the 1870s, and this slide by Schiffler, who's directly quoting the first plate from Goya's Disasters of War, and on into the 1890s with Redon, whose prints, like Goya's, portray humans trying to make sense of an unfathomable universe. These images assert the instability and uncertainty of all things, even, or perhaps even especially, those in the visible world. Goya died in 1828, which means he lived and worked in a pre-photographic era. Later artists who, like him, claimed the primacy of the imagination faced a special challenge after photography's invention in 1839. The new medium was quickly hailed for its ability to render visible reality. Just as quickly, a dichotomy emerged between photography, deemed mechanical and dispassionate, and printmaking, characterized as artisanal and subjective. Photography's objective accuracy disqualified it from fine art status, at least at first. Its artistic aspects were questioned, if not outright denied, in its early years. But commentators of the period may have overstated the opposition between these black and white media. In the exhibition section called Haunted Nature, which takes us deep into the forest, we see a converging aesthetic centered on overgrown thickets, gnarled trunks, deep shadows, and an overall sense of unease. This is the image I chose for the catalog cover. To me, it is a haunted image. Right away, something seems off. No one is here. A giant shadow impinges. From this photograph by Gustave Legray, you would never guess that the forest of Fontainebleau, where it was taken, was a magnet for artists and tourists alike. Located just 40 miles from Paris, the beloved site had become accessible by train in 1849, drawing ever-increasing numbers of day trippers bearing paint boxes and picnic baskets. Now let's consider that Legray photograph alongside some print examples, because maybe you're assuming that something went wrong with Legray's negative, that the dark band on the left side is an unintentional effect. Yet if we look at a print by Rodolphe Prédin on the left side of the screen, we notice that the deep shadow in the lower right corner looks just as menacing as the one at the left side of Legray's photograph. What might be lurking in there? Prédin's subject is ostensibly religious, but why does the Holy Family, resting on the opposite bank of the stream from the large shadow, look so tiny and vulnerable? And in the print at the right side of the screen by Martial, why do we have the impression of a forest so thick that we might never find our way out? The Barbizon School of Landscape Painting, which flourished at Fontainebleau in these very same years, gives a much more benevolent view of nature. See, for example, this landmark canvas by Corot, shown at the Paris Salon of 1846 and today in the collection of the MFA Boston. We can be sure that the eerie feeling we get from photographs and prints alike is a result of specific artistic intentions and decisions. In this photograph by Legray, he places the dark hollow of the oak tree at the center of the light-filled composition as a void around which everything else turns. We can contrast Corot's benign, picturesque view with Legray's unsettling, almost supernatural view. In Corot, we have a blue sky with puffy cumulus clouds. In Legray, a heavy canopy of tree branches. In Corot, a sense of mastery, man is in charge, versus in Legray, a sense of being overmastered, with nature in charge. The printmaker Prédin took the haunted aesthetic even further, with tangled branches, suffocating thickets, and trees that seem to possess an animist force. Here is his masterwork, the large and extravagant lithograph titled The Good Samaritan. So again, Prédin chooses a religious subject only to overwhelm it in a mass of vegetation, including exotic flora and fauna. The decadent writer Joris Karl Huysmans, in his novel Against the Grain from 1884, described this print as being like a work by Albrecht Dürer, composed under the influence of opium. So you're not required to add in the opium, but if you look closely when you're in the exhibition, you will see more and more birds, owls, monkeys, and other creatures emerging from every cranny of this work. Now, the next section of the exhibition takes us out of overgrown nature and into the world of the Gothic. In a sense, you could say that the entire exhibition is Gothic. By that, we mean eerie and spooky in the manner of Gothic novels. But in this section, I'm focusing on the architecture itself. By the 1850s, France's great medieval cathedrals like Notre Dame in Paris, Chartres, Reims, centuries-old sources of national pride, were suffering the consequences of long neglect. High-level cultural figures and government officials realized that quick action was needed to save these architectural landmarks. So in 1851, the French government launched the very first documentary mission in the history of photography. 5 vanguard photographers, including Legray, were sent to record medieval buildings throughout France, with the idea that the images they brought back could be used to assess needs and marshal support for restoration. But it's impossible to view these photographs through a purely disinterested documentary lens. With their strong emphasis on tactility and the weathering of old stones, these evocations of historical monuments prompt complex feelings of loss. Sometimes this quality of Gothic nostalgia reads as a fantasy of spiritual communion with the past. Henri Lesec, one of the 5 men sent on the photographic mission, was noted for his focus on architectural details rather than complete facades, and his elevated viewpoint enable an illusion of direct encounter with sculpted figures. In the Charles photograph at right, it's almost as if we could shake the saints' hands and speak with them. Here, the cathedral at Moulins is shown as a construction site with wooden posts, scaffolding, and debris strewn all around. The emphasis is on the fragility and vulnerability of these medieval buildings, once viewed as monuments for eternity. The printmaker Charles Meryon had a quasi-obsessive relationship with the Gothic structures in Paris, especially Notre Dame Cathedral. And if this particular gargoyle on Notre Dame's north parapet looks familiar, it's no doubt because of Meryon's etching, whose unique point of view has inspired many homages. At the Clark, we're fortunate to have not just the iconic etching, but also two preparatory drawings from which it was composited. Yet we shouldn't be fooled that the sculpture, which Meryon imagined as a vampire feeding on the city below, is a Gothic relic. It was a piece of contemporary art, brand new and affixed to Notre Dame by the restorer Eugène Viollet-le-Duc in 1860. The spire of the cathedral is likewise an addition by Viollet-le-Duc, and you may recall that after it burned in the tragic fire of April 2019, a perfect reconstruction was put in its place. Meryon was acutely aware of how fast the medieval character of Paris was disappearing. His own childhood home had been destroyed to make way for new construction, and he mourned these developments as a personal affront. The tower, prominent in Meryon's print, the Tour Saint-Jacques, also underwent a transformative modern restoration, as you can see in these 2 photos by Edouard Baldus, taken 6 years apart. So, concurrent with the renovation of France's Gothic monuments, Napoleon III, President and then Emperor of France, and his prefect of the Seine, Baron Haussmann, were pursuing a complete overhaul of Paris's urban fabric. This ambitious campaign of new construction under the general label of Haussmannization is normally told in triumphalist terms of progress and modernization, but it came at a steep cost, including the demolition of many old neighborhoods. These maps help to show the significant expansion of the city limits under Haussmann and the impressive number of new thoroughfares that got built. Broad avenues and boulevards replaced medieval warrens of winding, narrow streets. But the standard narrative of Haussmannization doesn't take account of pictures like this one on the left. You'd almost think Marville is reporting from a war zone, but would you believe this scene of upheaval was in the process of becoming the elegant Avenue de l'Opéra. As the official photographer of Paris under Emperor Napoleon III, Marville depicted the city in the midst of change. The image of barren desolation on the left shows the land cleared of buildings to push through a new boulevard. It's a foretaste of what is about to happen in the right-hand photograph. The buildings on this street were being progressively torn down, so those still standing to either side face imminent demolition. It's an uncanny image, almost like a stage set, culminating in a mirage-like vista. The statistic I've read is that for 30,000 new buildings erected under Haussmannization, 20,000 had to be knocked down. So where was all the construction material coming from? Well, it turns out that building within Paris relied on feverish quarrying activity at the city's edges, and the artists captured those places too. We see quarries in photographs, like this implacable, inhospitable view by Le Sec. We see them in this nocturnal, almost lunar drawing on blue paper by Charles Cazin, where the large wheels that are part of the quarry's operations resemble supersized torture devices. And in an etching by Schifflard at upper right, which is indebted to an illustration for Dante's Inferno by Gustave Doré, the famous passage, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter." Truly, the quarries were hellish places. Meanwhile, Napoleon III's plans for the glorious modernization of Paris didn't stop above ground, but extended to the city's catacombs and sewers, noxious subterranean environments captured by the pioneering photographer Nadar. Nadar gained attention in 1858 when he took the first ever aerial photographs from a hot air balloon. Just a few years later, having developed technology for photographing by artificial light, he was the obvious choice to go underground. He won a commission to photograph the Paris catacombs in 1862 and the Paris sewers in 1865. The system of Bunsen batteries that he patented enabled arc lighting underground, but required 18-minute exposure times. In the image on the left, you see the wayward collodion on the glass plate that is responsible for the ghost-like splotch hovering at the top. And isn't that lucky for me that it worked out that way for my exhibition? Now, the sewers and catacombs were on Napoleon III's agenda for renovation because of mounting concerns about sanitation and public health. Over the 19th century, successive cholera epidemics had raged through Paris, including an outbreak in 1865 that Schifflard commemorated in this, his most famous etching. An earlier cholera outbreak directly touched the life of Gérald de Nerval, the poet I quoted at the beginning, who was closely allied with the Shadow Visionaries. His mother died when he was just 2, and as a young man, he lost his true love. Nerval felt torn between his dreams and brute reality, which for him included homelessness, vagrancy, and being hospitalized for repeated breakdowns. On the night of January 25th, 1855, succumbing to spiritual crisis, he hanged himself on a seedy Parisian street called the Rue de la Vieille Lanterne. Nerval's friend, Gustave Doré, made this lithograph in memory of the poet. Death, blowing a horn, pulls Nerval's soul away from his body as ranks of celestial angels prepare to receive it. Nerval was 46 years old, the same age as Charles Marion when he died in an asylum, having been committed there for mental illness. All of which is to say that the Shadow Visionaries suffered greatly for their art. I'd like to steer clear of romantic cliches here, but it is quite true that they identified as outsiders, rejected conventional norms, and felt generally at odds with society. Some of them, like Bredin, lived in conditions of dire poverty and precarious lodging. Another Shadow Visionary, who fits the type is Charles Rambert, though we actually know very little about him, not even his birth and death dates. Only a handful of curators in my field that I've been able to find are familiar with his work or his name. In various lithographic series with cheerful titles like Murder and Evil, Rambert wrote his own texts to accompany visual critiques of social ills. While his images are allegorical, that doesn't mean they're hard to decipher. This one, for example, usury may be an old-fashioned term, meaning excessively high rates of interest charged on borrowed money, but you can't miss the point. The vampiric spider, filled to bursting with the blood it has sucked out of his victim, is the very image of extortionate greed. This more complex image includes a text denouncing the love of money. Now, you may sense a bit of a disconnect when I next tell you that Rambert mostly made his living as a designer of high-end metalwork and decorative objects aimed at an upper-crust clientele. In fact, practically the only work by Rambert I've seen published in the English language literature is the extraordinary Baby's Rattle, made for the Prince Imperial. It was made of gold, aluminum, coral, emeralds, diamonds. Imagine this fanciest toy of the realm in the hands of a squalling infant. Now, I don't have a good image of that rattle, unfortunately, but here are a couple of objects made by Rambert's employer, Froment Meurice, the leading silversmith in France, including a snuff box made for Napoleon III and a sumptuous silver gilt basin and ewer. To say the very least, Rambert had an ambivalent relation to imperial power. If we go back to his title page for Evil, we see on it a florid tribute to Froment Meurice, who had just died. At the 1855 exposition, Rambert won an award for his association with the firm. He was entirely dependent on Froment Meurice and indirectly Napoleon III for his livelihood. That cannot have been a comfortable position for someone so viscerally opposed to the regime and its materialist values. We might say that Rambert's prints, which had an extremely limited circulation from everything we can tell, were his outlet for this deep inner conflict. Rambert's nightmare visions make an apt segue into Alphonse Legros' etchings for tales by that master of horror, Edgar Allan Poe. The images were meant to appear alongside Charles Baudelaire's French translations of the tales, but unfortunately, the publisher ran out of money before the edition could be realized. Here is Legros' illustration for Shadow, and I included an excerpt from the tale. Just take a minute to let that sink in. Great Poe prose. And here is one for The Pit and the Pendulum, a story set during the Spanish Inquisition. Rats swarm as a lethal pendulum swings ever closer to the bound victim. Legros was an isolated figure who held to his style throughout a long career, even as the art world around him went through countless changes. In the 1890s, he was still making etchings on macabre themes, full of pathos. But because he never followed fashion, Legros doesn't fit easily into standard art historical surveys. However, he's perfect for the exhibition topic in the way that he blends shadow with light, sometimes suggesting supernatural vision or revelation. Now, that taste for the supernatural continues in the next to last exhibition section, Spaces of Dreams, which centers on the literary giant Victor Hugo. Hugo spent nearly 20 years in exile from France because he was so disgusted by the imperial regime of Napoleon III. During his time away, he flirted with the occult, for example, using a medium to communicate with the spirit world, and produced thousands of drawings that have rightly been called proto-surrealist. Wrapped up with his recurring evocations of fantastical architecture, notably castles, is the notion of a journey. In this example, boats in the foreground underscore that promise leading toward a distant horizon. But physical exile was not the only option, of course. One could also escape through the burgeoning genre of science fiction. In the exhibition, I juxtapose two distinct visions of worlds beyond our reach. Granville's imagining of interplanetary travel, very much fun, in Another World from 1844. And 3 decades later, Émile Bayard's illustrations of the lunar surface. Keep in mind, this was nearly a century before the actual moon landing in Jules Verne's Around the Moon. And here's a little fun fact, which is Bayard, the illustrator there, also illustrated Victor Hugo's novel, Les Miserables, and his Cosette became the logo for the long-running musical. So now, in the exhibition's coda, we come really full circle with symbolist artist Odilon Redon. His lithographs take up Goya-esque motifs like tormented figures struggling against forces of existential doubt. The full title of his print on the right of the screen is, quote, "And man appeared, questioning the earth from which he emerged and which attracts him. He made his way towards somber brightness," end quote. And appropriately enough, Goya's apprenticeship as a printmaker took place with Bredin in the city of Bordeaux, where Goya was buried. With his intense lithographic style, Redon achieved darker blacks than any of his predecessors, producing spellbinding images like this face-on view of the devil, absolutely terrifying, for Flaubert's Temptation of St. Anthony, and Death on a Pale Horse for the Apocalypse of St. John. So Redon, I would call the last of the Shadow Visionaries, and he would become the archetypal symbolist artist. With that, we come to the end of our story. So I am going to leave you with an image of the catalog cover and a reminder that Clark admission is free throughout these 3 winter months. And so I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you for your attention, and enjoy the exhibition. Will's there with a mic.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was so terrific. I'm really curious about Redon because I think about Redon as having these very colorful, beautiful oils, and this seems like such a difference. Could you comment on what happened to Redon?
It's a wonderful question. What happened to Redon is that he discovered color around 1900, just when he breaks off with the lithographs. So he has, there's a lot more to say about him and his engagement with black in the lithographic medium. He had very strong feelings about it, sort of moral and spiritual thoughts about what black meant, and it was a very considered decision not to produce works using color for a long, long period. And then I think he did just get seduced by pastel, and some of us know his absolutely gorgeous, materially rich, colorful pastels. And so, but that was a later period. And actually, so he was probably in his 60s by the point he switched over to color. Yeah, but thank you for the question. It's a very good one. Could we have the house lights up? I would love to be able to see that's happening in a moment. Thank you. Okay.
The Goya piece with the wall, that is death is pushing the wall, and the quote is, "And they wouldn't go," I think?
Yes.
Do you know the meaning of that, what that's about?
So Goya is famously cryptic in his very brief, sometimes two-word captions, sometimes one-word captions to his prints. So there are many different interpretations that have been overlaid for that print, and so they tend to cluster around the idea that people have not, before they die, they sort of have not properly taken account. They made a mess of things, and then they die, and it's sort of too late to make up for those faults or to do anything about them. So it is ambiguous for sure, and I wouldn't presume to say what was in Goya's mind, but it's pretty, I think it's a fairly strong consensus that is taken as a tombstone, a sort of funerary slab that's being pushed up. So the connection with mortality is absolutely there. Yeah. Thanks. Oh, there's a question way up there.
Were any of these visionaries exhibited in the Universal Expositions in Paris during this period?
So, yeah, there are a few. I said at the beginning that most were not, and most had very little public visibility in their lifetimes. There are some notable examples. Maybe I can get back to, I don't want to go too far. Oh, here. For example, it's the print on the right, The Death of the Vagabond. That's a loan from the Art Institute of Chicago here. And that we know is actually exhibited in the second Impressionist exhibition, if you can believe it, 1876. That's a little bit beyond my scope. But there's also The Good Samaritan, which, I don't know how far back that is, that we looked at here. It's coming up here. By Bredin, very large, ambitious print, and this was shown at the Paris Salon of, I think, 1861. So it's because of that, no doubt, that it recurs. A mention of it occurs in the novel by Huysmans. So that did have much more sort of public visibility. But for the most part, either the prints were being produced in very, very small print runs, available only to a close circle, or in the case of photography, they weren't being made for the marketplace. Photography was still in a very experimental phase. Yeah.
Were there partnerships between any of the early photographers and your sort of shadow etchers where they actually worked the medium and played off against one another?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I don't think I have a solid answer for you. In other words, I don't know of any collaborations. We can assume that at Fontainebleau, certainly photographers, printmakers, painters were all crossing paths there in those same years. But I will say it's a bit maybe audacious on my part to juxtapose the Legray photographs with the Bredin prints. They wouldn't have been seen together at the time, and also they were such different figures. And Bredin, very much an outsider, a recluse, an eccentric, who sort of wasn't, he was recluse. And then and extremely poor. And then you had Legray, who had a glittering public career. So sort of darling of the Second Empire. So, visually, I find it very compelling to put those together, but it doesn't reflect an actual interchange between the artists, so far as I know. But I would love to turn one up eventually. Other questions? Any more?
Oh, there's a question. Grace.
That's a question.
You mentioned that fascinating tidbit about how Redon and Mérion, despite having such kind of kindred styles and approaches, never even were potentially aware of each other. And I was wondering if there are any individuals in this exhibition who did have more of a relationship and were like kind of in conscious conversation with each other. Or if they were just all kind of operating very independently.
I mean, the best example of a close tie is that between Bredin and Redon, because it really was sort of master-pupil, teacher-pupil in the area of printmaking. So Redon learned his early printmaking craft from Bredin. They met in Bordeaux at an exhibition of works, and that's where Redon was from, and they did meet, and they had this kindred spirit, and there's correspondence between them, and they were close, and because Bredin was in such dire straits, it's funny because it's sort of Redon who's often the paternal figure saying, it'll be okay, I hope you have something to eat, I hope you have a roof over your head. But no, they, of course, were not exact contemporaries. So I think the more surprising is that Mérion and Bredin, who truly were contemporaries and who just linked together in so many of their concerns and certain parts of their biographies too. Again, I've just read in the literature there's absolutely no attestation that they even knew of each other, anything about their work. So I find that sort of staggering, but it tells you something about the isolation that these figures lived in. Yeah, thanks for the question.
PowerPoint available anywhere?
On my computer. It will be, this whole lecture is being recorded, and it will be posted on the website later on, so you can always consult it. It'll take about a week or so, but yeah. Thank you so much for your attention. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you.